Hey everyone, this is Craig here. By now, many of you are accustomed to the fact that at the beginning of each episode, I tend to unload a small freight train of announcements, upcoming events, reading groups, classes, panels. Today, I have a little more than usual. And look, I will do you a solid and tell you that this promo wraps up around the 7-minute mark, so you can start listening to the beginning of the episode right about at that time. But you may actually want to stick around for this one because we are announcing a totally free, open to the public panel on digital theory featuring friends of the podcast. And you will want to stay with me, especially if you have ever imagined stepping more fully into the space of independent or para-academic instruction as an instructor for the Acid Horizon Research Commons. More on that in a moment. First, a word about Acid Horizon Research Commons. Everything we do there, our courses, reading groups, in-person events, public panels, is made possible by those of you who have enrolled in a class or subscribed to our new course archive. Your support has allowed us not only to host our own seminars, but to attract serious lecturers, academics, theorists, and intellectuals to participate in panels and events under the AHRC banner. We are committed to providing free and enriched theoretical engagement to the public, just like our podcast, and it is your patronage that gives us the material footing to do so. This coming Thursday, February 19th at 10 a.m. Eastern, we are hosting our first event of this kind, a panel on digital theory, a book actually published by University of Minnesota Press by the same name, hosted by myself, and I will also be joined by Emma Stam of the Left Hand podcast and the many authors who are featured behind this volume. Digital theory argues that the digital is not merely about devices, but names a broader theoretical form of mediation structured by discrete units. The book explores how digitality shapes thinking, signs, and difference. M. Beatrice Fozzi lays out the ontological and epistemological stakes of digital theory. Alexander Galloway formalizes the symbolic conditions of the digital through 10 math themes, and Matthew Handelman and Leif Weatherby analyze its dialectic of quality and quantity. You may remember Alex. Alexander Galloway is a longtime friend of the show, and he generously provided the front cover blurb for our first book, Anti-Oculus. This will not be a standard lecture format. You can come sit down with me and Emma as we engage directly with the panel and invite comments and questions from attendees. And if you cannot attend the live event, it will be recorded and made available on the Acid Horizon Patreon in the ensuing days. Also, enrollment is ongoing for our George Bataille course and seminar led by Stuart Kendall, one of the foremost translators and scholars of Bataille's work in the English-speaking world. And he also happens to be a good friend of ours. The course, Formless, George Bataille and the Three Ecologies, will offer a sustained engagement with Bataille's thinking on sovereignty, excess, expenditure, the sacred, and the inhuman. This is not a light introduction. It is a serious immersion into Bataille as a living philosophical force still alive within our world today. Then we will have a second intensive seminar in the series that follows the first 4 weeks of the course. And I think at this point, more than half of them are filled. If you have ever wanted the opportunity to study Bataille with someone who has shaped how his work is read and translated, this is your chance. And beyond our live classes, our previous courses are now available on the Acid Horizon Research Commons course archive. Current patrons will receive a discount on archive subscriptions through March 31st. Subscribing to the archive is one of the best ways to support the growth of the Commons. It allows us to compensate instructors and lecturers fairly at a time when the academic humanities are struggling and too often failing their students. We are stepping in to help fill that gap, creating a space where serious thought circulates and where those who dedicate their time and energy to teaching are remunerated accordingly. And finally, a call for courses. The first phase of the Acid Horizon Research Commons was ushered into existence through our network of friends, comrades, and former guests. Moving forward, we want to broaden that horizon. We are looking to feature a wider diversity of intellectuals, artists, and presenters who can deliver thoughtful, rigorous, and politically engaged courses aligned with our broader set of values. We already have a tentative slate of courses stretching into the summer of 2026, but we are actively scanning for new teachers. Our mission is simple: to bring high-quality lecture series and seminars to our community at a competitive cost, while paying instructors at a rate that respects their labor and their expertise. In a moment defined by austerity, institutional contraction, and often a concerning silence from much of the establishment regarding the core struggles of our time, or a complete antipathy towards those struggles, we are building a space where communal intellectual life is materially supported. We provide scholarships for nearly every course, and we make concluded courses affordable in the archive, because access matters. If you are a teacher, scholar, artist, or independent thinker who feels aligned with this ecology, we invite you to submit a course proposal. It may take us some time to respond, but we will review all, or at least many of the submissions in due course. There is a dedicated email for proposals linked in the show notes. Before submitting, we encourage you to explore our current offerings. Familiarize yourself with our work and consider whether your proposal fits within the broader ecology of the AHRC. And it doesn't just have to be you. Let your friends, fellow graduate students, lecturers, and even tenured professors know if you think that they have something to offer the Acid Horizon Research Commons. All of this, panels, courses, archives, new instructors, is part of an ongoing effort to cultivate a living commons for theory, and we are grateful that you are building it with us. Now, on to today's episode with Adam, Richard Gilman-Opalsky, and Bruno Gulli as they discuss communist ontologies and communism as a form of life.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory podcast. Today, we are returning to a theme which is, of course, very close to our hearts on this show, the link between philosophy and communism, what philosophy can learn from an engagement with communism, and indeed, what communism can learn from an engagement with philosophy. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by the authors of Communist Ontologies, as a work that really tries to reignite the classical philosophical form of dialogue, which is also out now by our friends over at Minor Compositions. Big up Stephen, of course. And also as I'm glad to have the authors with me today, comrades Bruno Gulli and Richard Gilman-Opalsky, returning champion, to discuss ultimately the ontological contours of talking about communism as a new form of life, a new form of being together, a new form of relating, and a new form of becoming in such a way that we can become something beyond the limits of what capitalist political economy imposes on us, not only in what we can do, but indeed what we are. Bruno, Richard, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure as well, yes. Mm-hmm.
So it's despite the fact we're a philosophy podcast, and the history of Western philosophy begins with Platonic dialogues and these sort of narratives of interweaving ideas within the same page or within the same narrative. It's interesting that we finally are doing a dialogical work such as your own work, such as Communist Ontologies. And one of the ways in which I really appreciate how it engages with communist philosophy is it takes this refrain from Karl Marx's The German Ideology, or Marx and Engels' The German Ideology. I know Engels was in the backseat for that one. Namely, this definition of communism which takes it as a certain kind of negative thought apparatus, a kind of negative force in the history of thought, which does not simply try to overdetermine it with, for example, a programmatic approach or of a set kind of definition, but rather, as Marx and Engels themselves put it, they say that communism is not a state of affairs to be established. Communism is the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. Now, I want to ask, what does it mean to think this abolition ontologically, and how might we distinguish this kind of philosophical approach to communism from, say, an ideological approach to communism, which presents it as a sort of predetermined and fixed body of political doctrine?
Yes, I think this is really, in some ways, the central question of our work. And I think the first thing to say is that when we talk about the abolition of the present state of things, and we make an ontological approach to Marx and this idea of communism, it does not require any abandonment of political economy, which you mentioned in your opening question, that to make an ontological approach to Marx and Marx's concept of communism is not to choose to drop a discussion about political economy, is not to choose an alternative to transforming the material conditions of life. We must do both to fully appreciate the idea at the heart of Marx's concept of communism. So specifically, when we think about the abolition of the present state of things, we are talking about a radical transformation of the material conditions of life and work. And we think about that in materialist terms with Marx, but the deeper question is why? Why was Marx an abolitionist through and through? Why was it so important that to be a communist means the abolition of the present state of things? And the answer to that question of why we must, as communists, abolish the present state of things is because the form of life, as Marx understood it, the form of life in a world governed by capital, ruled by money, was variously unsurvivable, unsustainable, necessarily exploitative and expropriative. And Marx, of course, was thinking about other possible forms of life. He was thinking about this concept from Hegel of the Gemeinwesen, that what is the existing Gemeinwesen and what are possible Gemeinwesens? Or what is the possible Gemeinwesen? What would be a possible form of life? What is it as it such as it is, and what could it be? So when we talk about ontology, right, we're thinking there primarily about a branch of philosophy that is focused on the nature of being. But when we think about the nature of being, we understand that the nature of being is not fixed, right? So what is can become something else, right? And the way that this was put in a wonderful short book by Friedrich Engels called Feuerbach, The Roots of the Socialist Philosophy, when he was explaining Marx's attraction to Hegel, was that the real becomes unreal, right? Is that what is undone. And so when Bruno and I speak in this book about forms of life, when we make an ontological approach to communism and Marx, and we think about being and being in the world, we think that it necessarily requires talking also about becoming, the destabilization of what is, and the movement, the real movement involves a real movement towards a different form of life, a different state of being, and through a process of becoming. So the difference between ideology and philosophy is very important for us. Bruno and I are philosophers who insist on the importance of philosophy for what it means to be communists and revolutionaries. We insist on the importance of philosophy. But philosophy is not the same thing as ideology. You mentioned in your opening question the German ideology, which is, of course, a critique of ideology. So when we think about ideology, we're thinking about the finished worldview, like a pair of glasses. You look at the world through an ideological lens, and you interpret it in accordance with that ideological worldview or those lenses that you're wearing. Ideology is in some ways the end of philosophy because philosophy is not certain. It's uncertain. Philosophy doesn't really have an already fixed worldview. You can arrive through philosophy at the worldview of a communist or any other position imaginable. But the philosophical passage to ideology is one of uncertainty, questioning, and possibility. So if you think about communism in terms of becoming, destabilizing what is, the abolition of the present state of things and creating something else, if you think about ontology not just as being but as becoming. This is an open question for Bruno and I. It's one thing to describe existing forms of life. It's quite another to imagine possible forms of life on the horizon. And that is a philosophical question because I think today communists have to confess that we don't know. We don't know exactly how to get where we'd like to go. We don't know exactly what form of life would emerge in a post-capitalist society. We don't know, and that puts us into a necessarily philosophical position of uncertainty.
And I think it's also important as well to highlight that the text German ideology is itself a philosophical protest against ideology, not because Marx and Engels wrote it, but because it was assembled from a compilation of various notes and manuscripts by David Ryazanov at the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute in the 1930s. He was one of Stalin's Hegel teachers, and he did not survive this encounter, especially of this very abolitionist view of communism, particularly the crystallization of certain Soviet ideologies. And I think your focus there on the philosophical is a great through line to the next question, absolutely, because one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, Bruno, was this refrain throughout the dialogue of communist ontologies in which you posit philosophy as being a particular kind of science, and that is, quote, the science of distinctions. And I wanted to ask if you could expand on this characterization of philosophy, not in terms of the labor of making these distinctions, but how difference works in the formation of philosophical concepts in terms of relating these distinctions or just framing them as distinctions themselves.
Right. Absolutely. And I will read my answer but before doing that, I want to say to add to what Richard, you said, and I will touch on the question of a minor ontology in my second answer. Okay, so I leave that for now. But the question of one of the concepts that helps us in this is that of individuation, as it comes from Simondon. Gilbert-Simondon, and the idea of in the relation between being and becoming, when becoming ultimately is an aspect of being, but there is this defacing, to use his language, defacing of being, right, which is a wonderful concept because this other individuation, which is a never-ending process, right? So I'll go back now and answer the question, Adam. Right, according to what I wrote, I prefer to do that for now. So I say your question, Adam, thanks for it, allows or forces me to go beyond the use I make in the book of the notion of philosophy as a science of distinctions. So I will not repeat what I say in the book, and I will not refer to the context in which I speak about this notion. Rather, I will take a broader view in answering your question. Essentially, your question is about difference, the use of difference in forming concepts. I believe that this can be meaningfully addressed only if we look at the relation between identity and difference. And please interrupt me or to make comments, ask questions as I continue, right? So, identity and difference. To begin with, we find right here a wonderful example of a philosophy as a science of distinctions, precisely. A proper understanding of this particular distinction, namely the relationship between identity and difference, shows that they are not necessarily opposite concepts as he might seem at first. This is maybe a little problematic. And there is here an important moment of convergence. This is a very important concept, right? Convergence, which should be noted. Indeed, in the history of philosophy, and not only in so-called Western philosophy, there is plenty of material that points to or explicitly addresses that. Whether we think of Leibniz's discussion of identity and difference, right, whereby two substances can never be entirely the same and differ only in number, that is, in being two rather than one. And ultimately, this is the concept of a singularity, right? That goes back to Simondon as well, right? Or we think of Hegel's dialectical notion of the identity of identity and non-identity. We can clearly see what this means, right? Of course, Leibniz and Hegel are just two examples of what it means to deal with this question, but they are very important examples insofar as Among other things, Leibniz refers us directly to Parmenides, while Hegel, as is well known, and as he himself says in Science of Logic, right, refers us to Heraclitus. So we go back to the pre-Socratics, so-called, where we should be, I believe, right? So the ontological question, the question of being, is settled logically by answering a simple yes or no question. Is it or is it not? The answer is that yes, it is, and it cannot not be, because otherwise it would be nothing. But nothing is not and cannot be, because otherwise it would be something, right? That's the very often this question is understood only in terms of the logical, formal logic and so on, but there is much more in Parmenides that is usually not that it is overlooked, I believe. I'll go into that maybe in a moment. So, but nothing, right? So there is no exit for Parmenides, right? There is who establishes, if you will, whatever then is known as metaphysics, right? There is no exit from something, from what is, from being, right? To the next question as to what it is, right? After we know that it is, what is it? The answer is it is it itself. That's Parmenides. This is a distinction between being and nothing, between what is and what is not, that actually includes in a positive form both identity and difference, right? Nothing is not different from being. That's not the main distinction. Nothing simply is not and cannot be. This has important paradoxical implications for Parmenides, because it shows that reality includes potentiality. Right, that's what is usually overlooked by people considering Parmenides. Right, so that reality includes potentiality. The finite is a temporary expression, a form of appearance of the infinite, and the closed always takes place at the threshold of the open. So, in both Parmenides and Leibniz, the distinction is not between identity or sameness and difference, but between identity, in parentheses A equals A, and equality, A equals B. I don't know if I should say more about this, but right, that's an important difference, right? Right. So that's one of the distinctions that we are speaking about. Both identity and difference indicate the singular as an expression of the common. They constitute an open totality. Any substance, to use Leibniz's language, is identical with itself precisely insofar as it is different from all others. And it is different from all others insofar as it is identical with itself. Right? I hope that this is right clear. And so it is the distinction. This distinction, I want to also say, and that's important, is not analytical in a merely abstract sense, in the sense, for example, of whatever is known as analytic philosophy. Obviously, to speak about difference and distinction means to speak under the registers of ontology and epistemology. Right? Difference is about ontology, right? Distinction, epistemology. So, however, the distinction is here a concrete abstraction, not simply a mere abstraction, right? It's concrete, which retains the ontological nature of its identity/difference composition, namely of its singularity, right? So the main distinction ultimately becomes the distinction that gives rise to singularity, which is the singular as an expression of the common. In this sense, it also has being concrete, right? It also has an existential and synthetic character. The distinction is not based on epistemology, the views the knower, right, detached from the known, right? If you will, it's a kind of embodied epistemology, or a Richard, if I may, even a riotous epistemology, right, to borrow a phrase from a book that you, Richard, wrote with Stephen Sukaitis, right? So I don't know if you accept that, but I think it can be applied right precisely to this, right? So and I think that's very important to borrow. So let me illustrate this with an example, if I may, from Chuang Tzu, right, an ancient Chinese thinker of the Taoist school. Okay, so in chapter 17 of the Chuang Tzu, called Autumn Floods, Chu Shui, in Chinese, Chuang Tzu is seen walking on the bridge of the Hao River with Wei She, another person. Looking at the fish freely and easily swimming in the water, Chuang Tzu remarks that they are evidently happy. Wei She, the other guy, says, you are not a fish. How do you know that the fish are happy? Chuang Tzu replies, you aren't me. How do you know that I don't know that the fish are happy? They briefly continue the conversation. Then Chuang Tzu concludes by saying that he knows simply by standing above the river. Right? So this is very important. Maybe we can elaborate on this later, but that's the epistemology, basically, the ground for this knowing, right? Which is very concrete, very situational, right? So the point is here that, right, that Chuang Tzu's position, his point of view, in the literal sense of a position, is immersed in the situation at hand. There is no real separation, but again, a convergence of the singular and the common. That is the singular in the common, and at the same time emerging from it, right? So in a sense, this is similar to Marx's notion of the emancipation of the senses, which is something that I really love, from the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. Marx says that after the abolition of private property to be sure, that is to say, when the common appears as common, the senses become theoreticians immediately in their praxis. That's from Marx, a quote, right? To be a theoretician is to be able to see, right? From the Greek, right, etymology, right? And thus to know. But this doesn't happen in a purely abstract manner. Again, the abstraction is concrete, and it is arrived at through a process not only of analysis, but also of a synthesis. Let me now add a few remarks on Hegel and Heraclitus. At first sight, the frame is here completely different to what we saw in Leibniz and Parmenides, with the interval of Chuang Tzu, right? Traditionally, the difference is spoken about in terms of the distance between dialectics and metaphysics. However, there is convergence here too. Indeed, many thinkers, including Heidegger, have highlighted the fact that ultimately Parmenides and Heraclitus say the same. Parmenides is usually seen as the thinker of permanence, Heraclitus as the thinker of change. In Heraclitus, difference is even more visibly inherent in the constitution of a reality. In the paradox of the river, for example, right? The idea is that, I'm quoting from the fragments, right? We step into and we do not step into the same river. And he adds, Heraclitus, we are and we are not. In other words, we are the same and not the same. We are the same and we are different at the same time. This is the dialectical principle found in Hegel as the identity of identity and non-identity, namely the notion of becoming. That's precisely what becoming is. That's in the science of logic, right? Hegel says, right? I mean, it's neither being nor nothing at the beginning, right? What we find is actually that being has passed over, not even that is passing over, has passed over into nothing and nothing into being. Ultimately, we had a becoming, and what is becoming? It is coming to be. Everything changes, therefore, and yet there is something in Heraclitus himself and in Hegel. There is something that does not change, and that is change itself. So we had change and permanence at the same time. The process of becoming never starts and never ends. The process, one might say, using, I go back to the language of Gilbert Simondon that I mentioned before, of individuation without to be sure, without principle of, right, simply individuation, right, without principle of individuation, because otherwise Simondon, of course, says otherwise that's a contradiction. If you have a principle of individuation, then there is a beginning, right? So, but this individuation as a process is always there. In one of Heraclitus' fragments, beautiful fragments, we read, it rests by changing. Again, a moment of convergence of the two concepts or aspects of reality, right? Change and permanence. Here, too, in a perhaps stronger fashion than in Parmenides, we have precisely the convergence of change and rest, becoming and permanence, relative or a temporary permanence, to be sure. I mean, that doesn't last forever, right? So this is the way in which philosophy, through difference, is the science of distinctions. Obviously, the idea could be illustrated in other ways, but I hope what I have said may serve as an indication of a more general paradigm. I don't know if addresses the question.
Thank you. And then in terms of the metaphysical and epistemological implications, at least as I'm sort of retreading your description back to myself, in terms of philosophy being a science of distinctions, it essentially has to look at essentially forms of individuation, forms that are not necessarily fixed, but are distinct modes of the transitions between different states of being. And insofar as there could be transitions between those different states, we can therefore talk of them as existing within a common, say, community, to use the old term from Kant, to say community of different beings, different distinctions, such that when we have an individuated being, an individual entity, we cannot simply detach it from a web of relations outside of it, nor can we simply think of it as a purely atomized, irreducible individual entity that is not itself complex, not itself composed of relations both external and internal. I mean, the way I'm trying to think about it is, and this is my problem, I can't help, I'm a trained German idealist, this is the problem, which is thinking about the German idealist critique of matter from Schelling, where it's like, okay, we look at the atoms, but actually, if we look at matter, what's matter composed out of? If we zoom in, it's composed out of attractive and repulsive forces. It's pushing everything else away from itself, and it's attracting itself back into itself. And so there's these forces that we may think of in scientific terms today as strong and weak nuclear force. And so if we use a little bit of, God forgive me for using too much science on this podcast because I'm not trained to use it, a little bit of Einstein, you do a bit of equation between matter and energy, and we can see that these relations end up holding, which in everyday experience we see as very stable entities, whereas actually it's just a kind of, when you think about it mathematically maybe, and I don't mean that to make it more complex, I mean the sense of like rounding off. We don't think of every number of pi, we have a certain cutoff, and the habits of what we cut off determine our experience of those entities. Am I getting kind of close to, just in case I might completely mischaracterize what you're saying?
No. It is, and actually, as you were speaking, since I mentioned it in relation to, and Parmenides in relation to Leibniz, if we think about this, what we usually understand as the closed sphere in Parmenides being that that is limited, ultimately finite, which is a contradiction in terms, because then beyond that limit, and then of course the atomists, and then Epicurus and Lucretius teach us that there would be what? Something else? Nothing. So it is a contradiction. So this being, even in Parmenides, must be open and ultimately changing. So it's the convergence between Parmenides and Heraclitus in a sense, and Leibniz too, the monads. Yeah, the monads are what they are. Each one is identical precisely with itself. And however, at the same time, they do change. Right, so I mean, there is this very difficult idea to penetrate, that we should not dismiss it just because it is difficult. That's the convergence of the two things, right? I mean, and that the point is also because you mentioned numbers at one point, and of course we know, I mean, but the question is that even these numbers, I mean, if we think about numbers in completely merely abstract terms, that's one thing. But if we try to understand not numbers per se, but the reality of things, right? We see that it cannot be reduced to something fixed forever. Although we had things that appear at one point in the impermanence and in the whole traditional pre-Socratic philosophy, we have this moment of the appearance of something. And the cycle in pre-Socratic philosophy is precisely that things go back. Think about Anaximander's great fragment, the lines from Anaximander when he says the things that are perish into the things from which they come to be, because they had to pay penalty and retribution for the injustice according to the ordinance, the order of time, Anaximander says, right? So there is this never ending, even before we get to Hegel and then we get to Simondon, there is already at the beginning of, again, pre-Socratic philosophy, this clear sense of a process that never begins, never ends. So, I mean, but it is there that we can, I don't know if I made that clear, but that we can see that moment of convergence, which is very difficult, which is ultimately precisely might be in philosophical terms, if not the explanation, but certainly a way of addressing this very serious question.
And so we have this ontological viewpoint that focuses on interrelations, focuses on processes that are not themselves fixed, that are not themselves over. And this, if we think about of reality in this manner, then any kind of fixed social form, any kind of fixed historical epoch, already contains within itself the potentials for new combinations, new arrangements, and therefore a rupture in their own forms. And to this extent, I think this is very good to transition to the prospect of not simply as we've gone from talking about sort of a general ontology, but also thinking about ontology, particularly in terms of the transitionary activity of communism, which is not simply an abolition in terms of an abolition of a certain paradigm in ontology, but also about ontologizing the activity of this abolition in a real terrain of experience and struggle. And I guess the next question I had was, hey, how do we think of this activity of revolt, of insurrection, of revolution ontologically? I mean, there's a quote again from yourself, Bruno, that really drew my attention, which is, quote, "Any activity or action that defies this new pattern of the world, from migration to labor struggles to all forms of resistance to domination, oppression, and exploitation, including writing as a form of resistance and revolt, can be seen as operating in the direction of the production of insurgent ontologies." And I guess I had to ask, what does it mean for an ontology to be insurgent? And I guess what does this tell us about being? And maybe just say something a little bit before we just kick off with this one. I guess, I mean, the history of ontology as a method, for example, of arguments in philosophy has had its ups and downs, I guess, in history of philosophy, because we used to have ontological argument, for example, which was sort of invented by sort of Christian philosophers mainly, but started, yes, with Parmenides. And there was a risk sometimes of a kind of over-definition, defining things into existence. And then with Kant, we had to take a step back from that and start analyzing being rather than trying to invoke it purely into existence. I wanted to ask how we can think revolt ontologically, I guess, not only sort of given history of ontology, but just how would you cash this out? And of course, I want to bring you in, Richard, as well as also somebody written a lot about this, of course, in Spectres of Revolt as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, let me again say what I had prepared, and we can continue. But so I say that I want to address this question, right, Adam, in terms of a minor ontology. That is to say, in terms of a delusion, emphasis on becoming and flux, right? That's what we had been talking about already, right? So that's a minor ontology. The phrase is not found in Deleuze himself, but that's basically the idea, the differential ontology and so on, right? So, of course, I don't mean to imply that the question of being can be dismissed as irrelevant. In fact, it remains the most relevant question, even when the emphasis is shifted on becoming, which is, again, an aspect of being. But an aspect doesn't mean that it is less important than being itself. I mean, it is the aspect of being. So we should remember that Heidegger, in his confrontation with metaphysics, stresses the difference between metaphysics guiding and grounding questions. He does so, for instance, in the first volume of his lectures on Nietzsche of 1936-37, called The Will to Power as Art. And there he says that metaphysics can only ask the guiding question, right? The guiding question, and that is the question of the being of beings, but he cannot ask the grounding question of a being as such, okay? Be it as it may, right, whatever, the question of being remains central to any ontological project. As Deleuze beautifully says in Difference and Repetition, this is a wonderful quote, I believe, a single voice raises the clamor of being, unquote. This is Deleuze's univocal ontology, which comes to him directly from Jan Duns Scotus and his doctrine of the univocity of being, which must always be understood together with Duns Scotus's other fundamental concept of aidity, that is, thisness or singularity. Indeed, the two concepts taken together yield precisely a minor ontology, one in which becoming is the main aspect of being. Right, and so we know that, of course, Duns Scotus was important for Deleuze, but also Simondon, many others. Right. So I think that this is very important. I am actually, if I may, I am currently, and Richard knows that, I'm currently working on this question with my friend Eugene Lim. We are writing a book entitled Coming Communism, Singularity and Contingency, right? Singularity and Contingency. We make use of this minor ontology, an ontology, if you will, of the margins and of the accident, right? This is always an insurgent ontology, I believe, one that comes from the danger and from the wind, and one where the singular and the common become one and the same. With Eugene, we are speaking about the wind, which is also important in Deleuze and Guattari's understanding of a minor ontology. In 1000 Plateau, they say, I'm quoting, flows of intensity, their fluids, their fibers, their continuums and conjunctions of affects, the wind. Right, W-I-N-D, right? The wind, fine segmentation, micro-perceptions have replaced the world of the subject, to which I'll go back briefly to the question of the subject, right? Unquote. A minor ontology does not dispose of being, but of the subject, or the principle, or whatever, right? One concept that Eugene and I had conceived of, and that we intend to use, not as a metaphor, but as a theoretical construct, is what we call the gathering of many gatherings, which displaces the concept of the subject and challenges the concept of the multitude. To go back to your question, Adam, and to conclude, this is what the activity, indeed the act of communism, coming communism, as a revolt is. It is an insurgent movement, once again a gathering of many gatherings against which there is no form of constituted power, no Leviathan capable of withstanding for long.
Maybe this is a complete next question about the subject of revolt. Then, if the subject might not be the right term here, but if we want to turn to revolt, please, Richard, I'd love to know what you think about how we can also develop this sort of an insurgent ontology.
Yeah. So thanks for all of that, Bruno. Very stimulating and very interesting. I think one way we could, one heading under which we could put some of Bruno's comments, if not all of them, is the materiality of becoming. And that goes back to the Heraclitus example. And I think we would do well to consider systems of fixity in the world. If we're going to talk about insurgent ontology, revolt, and communism, we should look at systems of fixity, which depend upon either this concept of a fixed being or an ontological fixity, or the reproduction of the status quo, which is completely antithetical to the definition that Marx and Engels give in the German ideology of communism. But to make it concrete in a couple of ways, first, I share with comrades and listeners that I am currently teaching again in a maximum security prison. I'm teaching a course on the abolition of prison. And the story of how that came to be was the Department of Corrections needs to review everything that you're going to be assigning for the students to read. So what I found is that if you send them 1,000 pages of Foucault, you get the green light. You're allowed to go in. But if you look at mass incarceration as a system of fixity, the entire system of mass incarceration is contingent upon ontologically fixing the criminality at a particular point in the lives of people who were born into, in many cases, unbearable material conditions of life, poverty, abandonment, neglect, drug use, sexual abuse, all forms of untreated psychosocial affliction. And the idea that somebody is going to spend multiple lifetimes incarcerated is contingent upon the idea that their being is ontologically fixed at a particular point in the past. And what I find inside of the prison is what I would call an insurgent ontology, which is to say that there is resistance there to this concept that one's being is ontologically fixed to a particular act. Myself, I'm very critical of some of what's in the United States prison activism that is centered on what is called the Innocence Project, or exoneration of wrongful convictions, because what this claims is that a person is only worth fighting for if they were wrongfully convicted and innocent of the crime they were charged with. And this maybe bridges to what we might talk about here in a minute, having to do with humanism. We might get to that through this passageway. But why is innocence even necessary? Because a person who does something awful is also not fixed, but as Bruno, they're ontologically fixed at that point in time. But as Bruno, I think, beautifully elaborated, their process of becoming is not totally detached from the material conditions of their being at a previous moment in time. And this is why I'm thinking about the materiality of becoming. But when we think about insurgent ontology, just to add something here on the question of revolts, mass mobilizations, insurgencies, uprisings, they are all, in some very clear ways, I would say, they are all of them about destabilization of ontological fixity, the real becoming the unreal. For example, so yesterday in my prison class, we had a session on post-colonial theory, and we were talking about subalternity, and we were talking about Fanon and Spivak, and the movement, the real movement to abolish the present state of things is a very philosophical process, because in processes of decolonization, which of course we're talking about here, concrete real movements that radically transformed the lives of real people all around the world, not only, but largely in the 20th century, these processes of decolonization and freedom struggles, but they were all about the possibility of a different form of life, this kind of post-colonial. Of course, Bruno and I think a lot about post-capitalist forms of life, but there is a passage from the ontological state of coloniality. And this is not merely philosophical in a sort of brash, dismissive way, because when we think about a situation like the form of life in Gaza, when you have people who are living in a dilapidated state of genocidal destruction, the question of possible forms of life is concrete. And inside of the prison, what I found is that philosophy is not abstract, it's concrete. When you are talking philosophy in a maximum security prison, discussions about human freedom are not abstract. There is nothing abstract about the possibilities of emancipation and human freedom in a place like a prison. So transitioning just for a moment now to Minnesota, as we are having our conversation shortly after a period where in the United States, the federal government is deploying troops in major cities, the ICE agent deployments. It's an incredibly dangerous development, which definitely and rightfully brings to mind the late Weimar Republic. If you can think about the kinds of things that Rosa Luxemburg was thinking about and were a part of her own material conditions of life, let's say in 1919, for example, 1918. And these mass mobilizations, these movements, when they are localized, unfortunately, what I might consider their communist power, or the sort of the potentiality of them, of these movements as communist real movement, is limited because the federal government can deal with localized mobilizations fairly well. So one hopes, of course, that they will spread, that they will grow, that they will move into a phase of strike activity and other forms of uncontrollable, ungovernable disruption. But all of this is a response to an unacceptable form of life. And it doesn't require an ontological theory of communism to be able to see that mobilizations against the deployment of ICE agents in major cities across the United States, that they are opposed to this present state of things. That doesn't mean that they are anti-capitalist. That doesn't mean that they are self-consciously communist, but they belong to the category of real movement against the present state of things, right? And so I think that one of the big questions about an ontological approach to Marx and the subject of revolt is to understand that where we see revolt, whether we're talking about Algeria, whether we're talking about mass mobilizations in one place or another place, global uprisings, what we're seeing are of human movements against the present state of things that contain within them already a self-conscious rejection of the present state of things. Now, if you go down into these movements and you try to drill down, what would you want instead? Imagine a liberal capitalist journalist, which, will then descend upon with hang microphones outside of the balcony of a bourgeois hotel in Minneapolis and ask, well, what is it that you want? Which is what they asked also when the George Floyd rebellion was happening in the same city. What is it that you would want? You'll get different answers. It's a much more philosophical phase. You see, we're talking about a philosophical passage of questioning, possibility. But to Bruno's point about what I would call the materiality of becoming, what will be emerges from what is. I mean, this is a basic point of Marx, is that in order to understand or to think about some possible horizon, we have to begin with things such as they are. And so the kind of communist ontology that Bruno and I are dealing with is very attentive to things such as they are. It's not some kind of an idealist abandonment of thinking about the material conditions of the world, things such as they are. Not at all. It's very much grounded in an understanding of things such as they are, and also the understanding that they have got to be radically transformed, abolished, and become something else.
No, thank you. I mean, I think it's a good thing to point out, particularly in we thinking about the analysis of movements, insofar as there is an impulse of abolition within them, there is nonetheless a seed of something we may call communism by this Marxist understanding of it in terms of abolition, even if it doesn't necessarily develop into a abolition of the totality. Every abolitionist movement contains a seed of a wider abolition of all the interconnected institutions and practices which sustained and founded the initial object which we're looking to abolish. It's why there's a containment practice against these movements where they say, okay, people say, oh, I want to abolish ICE, and they say, well, but let's build it to abolish DHS, let's say abolish the Democrats, for example, and this is where it ends up spilling, and especially in terms of the other direction where, the US Constitution, in terms of the various violations thereof, has become fundamentally destroyed. Doesn't mean that what's going to come after is going to be communist, but, we've had successive French republics, so we would need to be a kind of reconstitution if that was going to be something to adequate to some of the abolitionist demands, but not necessarily fulfill the totality of abolition as is latent in any abolitionist revolt. And in terms of changing the form of life, changing our existence, there's one note in the dialogue in the book that comes up quite a bit, is the question of humanism. Is there anything particularly special about the human? Is there a human essence? And in terms of the way that people have read Marx philosophically, this has been quite a contentious question pretty much since. It was a contentious question before Marx. It was the 1840s in Germany that had these debates over humanism, and humanism was kind of the order of the day until someone like Max Stirner showed up, and then Marx sort of. There was this debate in the 20th century led by Louis Althusser that says that Marx broke with his philosophical roots in people like Hegel and Feuerbach and indeed a humanist tradition, and instead became a kind of anti-humanist. Marxist anti-humanism became a kind of not anti-philosophical, but a different strand of Marxist philosophy, which tried to get rid of some of the more, let's say, warmer or more sort of humanistic, more genuinely, I would say sometimes more inspiring parts of the Marxist tradition. I think the good distinction maybe is between this idea of the cold streams and the warm stream of Marxism. You have the hard dialectical science and the soft political revolts, the artistic side of feeling. How do we want to frame this ontological approach to communism in terms of an approach to the human, the category of the human in general?
Yeah, so this requires, I think, an intervention into part of what you invoke there, Adam, about this long history of philosophical discourse on humanism. Part of the problem is that, one can identify as an anti-humanist or a Marxist humanist or some other kind of a humanist. But for me, this identification is ultimately uninteresting. I'm much more interested in not so much in these different identities at war in the history of Marxism. And maybe I'll mention some of those battles just briefly here in a moment. But in what we might mean when we think about the human being in becoming in terms of an ontological approach to Marx, what we might mean by that. So the first thing is, of course, in the early Marx, in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, as is rather well known for people who are reading Marx, there is this whole discussion largely attributed to an early debt, if you will, to Hegel and Feuerbach about species being. And many Marx scholars and Marxists and activists and revolutionaries see traces of this kind of humanistic essentialism about the human being as an essence there in the early Marx. And then say, as Althusser, as you rightly point out, that he breaks with this later on when he becomes a more mature materialistic thinker and jettisons any kind of essentialist thinking about the human being as such. I think that basically at that point, let's say at the point of Althusser on up to even the present, there has been an unfortunate mischaracterization, which we discuss in our book, of humanism. And as much as I have learned from and will continue for the rest of my life to learn deeply from the work of someone like Antonio Negri, you can see in his book, Marx Beyond Marx, Notes on the Grundrisse, that he completely gets it wrong. And I've never been totally sure as to why, if it was a deliberate mischaracterization of the Marxist humanists, what specifically is wrong. What is wrong is the idea that people who talk about the human dimension in Marx are asserting some kind of fixed essential nature of the human being. That is wrong. That is absolutely false. To talk about humanism as a Marxist does not require at all the insistence on a fixed essential human being. It's quite to the contrary. What else is wrong, and can explain why here in a moment, but what else is wrong is the idea that this concern about human becoming is only to be found in the early writings of Marx. It's not true. So one of the people that Negri mischaracterizes very directly in his book, Marx Beyond Marx, is Raya Dunayevskaya, Dunayevskaya being associated as one of the major founding figures of Marxist humanism. But she finds a concern with human becoming and human being in the late Marx. She has a wonderful essay on women's liberation and the Grundrisse, in which she mines all of this content from Grundrisse, which is, of course, a posthumously published book, but nonetheless later work of Marx. She mines all of this ontological content about possible human becomings. And then, and here I can read this briefly, I found it before we began from Capital Volume 3. There's this famous line of Marx in Capital Volume 3 where he says, beyond it begins that development of human energy, which is an end in itself, the true realm of freedom, which, however, can blossom forth only with this realm of necessity as its basis. And so he's talking about the shortening of the workday. In the context of Capital Volume 3, he's talking about the reduction of the workday. And so obviously that implicates the form of life. And the question at the heart of this is human power is its own end. What can humans be? What could humans become in a world that wasn't governed or ruled by capital? So even again in the late Marx, just a short time before his death in the Critique of the Gotha Program, the very famous and beautiful line, which Bruno and I deeply appreciate, particularly when the two of us think together about disability, is from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. Who can read that without understanding that this is about a different form of life? He is not describing what is. He is describing what could be. He thinks of it specifically in terms of the horizontal banner that could be hung upon this communistic future, if you will. So I think when we talk about humanism, as I understand it, we're talking about human being and human becoming. We're talking about nothing to do with some human essence, some kind of a fixity. That's the carceral idea. The carceral idea is that there is something deficient in the humanity of the criminal that cannot be overcome, that there is something fixed ontologically as a deficiency or danger in the humanity of the inmate. And that is the reason why, if they committed a crime in 1987, they must die there, right? So the way that I approach the question of humanism is not in some kind of a campist logic of debate, but rather to just be honest about the fact that we Marxists and communists who are thinking about the abolition of the present state of things and the radical transformation of the world are also hopeful about human possibility, about forms of about forms of relationality, about forms of life, emancipated from a world governed by capital. So in my book, The Communism of Love, I'm exploring forms of life that are resistant to or suggestive of human relationality that is not governed by the logic of capital. And so for me, when I speak of humanism, when I think about humanism, it is in no way to take sides in a debate with Althusser and Negri and Erich Fromm and Raya Dunayevskaya and Jean-Paul Sartre and all these others who call themselves either humanists like Maurice Merleau-Ponty and anti-humanists. It's rather to cut down beneath all of that superstructural debate into the core question of Marx's whole project. What could we become? What can we do? What is the flourishing and the realization of human capabilities, so that when Marx talked, not just in Capital Volume 3, but in the German ideology about the shortening of the workday, he was imagining a different form of life. Famously, and Bruno would love this, with all of that time left over for poetry, as Bruno is a wonderful poet, it's very much about human possibility of different forms of life, human relationality, And I just think that we have to grasp that. And I think it's crucial to an ontological approach to Marx. And I also think it's highly resonant because we are living in societies all around the world now that are dehumanizing. The other side of humanism is dehumanization, one could argue. And again, not to sort of wear a hat and join a club, but genocide is impossible without dehumanization. Mass incarceration is impossible without dehumanization. And I would argue more broadly that capitalism depends on it. And so we better think about, claim, retrieve, and openly own this fundamental idea about human possibility. And in this way, I'd say an ontological approach to Marx would be actually quite necessary to 21st century Marxism and revolutionary politics today.
It's really interesting because in a way, as I understand what you're saying, you're not quite disagreeing with Althusser in the sense that you don't think there is any break. Rather, you're putting the break actually a lot further back than Althusser does to this extent, because if we're going to call Marx a pure anti-humanist in Althusser's sense, you would have to say, okay, Marx was a Feuerbachian, and then he suddenly stopped being a Feuerbachian, because Feuerbach, for listeners, does have a very fixed version of human essence, even more fixed than Hegel does, and it's why people at Max Turner can critique him with this essentially inventing a new form of humanist dehumanization by having this abstract essence be the measuring stick against which other people can be rendered as inhuman or deficient. And you can also see this reappear in other times in history of philosophy, for example, such as in a discourse on colonialism, Aimé Césaire, where this humanism creates dehumanization. And it seems like what you're saying is you're actually putting the break further back to the extent of saying, no, Althusser thinks that Marx was a Feuerbachian. But if we say that actually he broke with Feuerbach earlier than, say, earlier when he was writing these humanist texts, then we can separate him from this very carceral notion of the human before the discourse of Marxist humanism has even really started. Am I getting what you're saying there?
Yes, exactly. I mean, to put it in the shortest possible form, the idea that any humanism in Marx is the private property of the essence of Christianity is absurd. This is a kind of a reductive reading of not just the early, but also the late Marx. He was already thinking beyond Feuerbach at a very, very early stage. In his 20s, he was thinking way beyond Feuerbach. And so the language changes, the work develops. The language changes, the work develops. The analysis deepens. What else would you expect from a lifetime of intensive study of the existing state of things? What else would you expect from a life maybe given over more than any other life I can think of, devoted to answering the single question, what is capital? What does it do to us? What could we do beyond it? But I would argue that this reductionist reading of even the early Marx, that he was somehow trapped in some essentialist Feuerbachian religiosity about the human being, is just patently absurd. And we don't have to treat every discussion about human possibility as if it's tainted with that.
Bruno, please.
No, first of all, yes, I completely agree with Richard, and I want to maybe go back briefly to two things. One are the concept of fixity that you used in two different contexts, but then you related the two, right, yourself, the carceral, and then the question about humanism, the essence. I mean, again, I like and I completely agree with what, and this, if you will, maybe also maybe related to what I was doing in terms of the discussion of Parmenides and Heraclitus. The finite is never finite. And of course, I mean, the openness, the potentiality, the becoming, as you say, is always there. And that's what we learn precisely from whether we look at Parmenides in one way or Heraclitus in the other, because this is ultimately, I like also what you say, Richard, very much about the problems, the danger of the reductive reading of this question of humanism and many other important fundamental questions that had to do with certainly human life as part of the entirety of life and of being, the cosmic and so on and so forth. It is not only reductive, it's responsible too. I mean, I don't understand why people stay in that camp is kind of a whatever paradigm or whatever it is. But I really don't have much patience with that because I think it's irresponsible. It is philosophers, thinkers, people in general who think like, I mean, should precisely focus on what's important in foundational in human life, human flourishing, and life in general. It's not, I mean, the problem that people see with this very often is the fear of ending up with a kind of anthropocentric position, which is that of the essence and so on and so forth. But no, regardless of the category, I couldn't care less about humanism or whatever, right, as you, Richard, were also saying. But the question is that actually this centric position, which is problematic, it would be problematic, but this is not exactly what the Marxist humanist tradition does. No, it's not anthropocentric at all. It is actually recognizing the potentiality of change becoming in the human being as one form of life among many other forms of life, recognizing the fact that people and communities can change, that the direction that we take, that is up to us. Even if we look at Spinoza, who's very often used by people in that whatever camp. But Spinoza says, I mean, he makes a very clear distinction, going back to the question of distinctions between nature or God, the substance, right, that has no ends in view, and the human community. The human community must have ends in view. I mean, we do one thing or the other. We choose one direction or the other. We can bring about destruction as we are doing right now, especially with these people governing the world, starting, as you were saying, also from the US, especially there right now. I mean, it's not only there, everywhere really, but I mean, it's amazing what's happening. Of course, the violence, state violence that is rendering life impossible for many people. I mean, you made reference to the situation in Minneapolis and, of course, many other similar situations in other cities and so on. So, I mean, if we don't understand that it is up to us, to communities emerging from real material conditions of life, accepting and working towards that idea, as you said, of from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, and that it is up to us to change direction. That, to go back to Spinoza again, it is ultimately our task to move towards joy or sadness, and we're moving towards sadness and distraction. But we can choose a different direction by precisely increasing the power, potential that we had to act in a certain way, rather than decreasing it, right? Because that's what brings about sadness. So there is I don't know, the word responsibility might seem too strong, too big. I don't know, but it is, to go back to the idea that you were speaking about all species being, it is something that the human being has, not because of any superiority with respect to the other beings, not because of, and here Heidegger actually may help us, it is not of our choosing to be the way we are and to be able to destroy or to create, and Heidegger very often refers to Hölderlin and poetry in general in that sense, right? That the danger, where the danger is, there is also the saving power, right? So, but it is that at that moment that the human may act in a way that, or may not act, or act in other ways that has an important impact on other things as well, the non-human animals, for example, beings in general, and so on and so forth. So we should keep this in mind. So whether the humanist position is not to say, oh, look, I mean, we are better, we are superior, and so on and so forth. We are the center. No, we are not at the center of anything. But we have, to go back to the question of distinction, there is an essential difference. There is a specificity. There is a singularity in what it means to be human. It's not that it is better than being a tree or a non-human animal or whatever. No, it's not. It's neither better nor worse. It is what it is, but we must use, that's where then not only politics, but ethics, of course, has an important role, of course. I mean, it is up to us, doesn't mean, of course, it means the opposite of the liberal idea of I do as I, no, I don't do as I please, not at all. And in fact, this is what the idea of a relationality and the interdependency teaches us. I want to say, and Richard, you know this very well, we spoke so often about this, but one of the most important concepts for me in philosophy and positions that directly relates to Marx's idea of from each, according to the ability to each according to their needs, is this idea of a dependency, the fundamental dependency that we find we have in human life, which is defined not as something better than other forms of life, but as a deficient, as philosophical anthropology says, a life that is grounded in a lack, a deficiency, right? And there is this book that as Richard very well, I often refer to by Eva Kitay, which is the book is the title is Lost Labor: Essays on Women, Equality and Dependency. And this is the concept that I find in that book that I found many years ago, that I used in my second book, right, Earthly Plenitudes. But the dependence is the inescapable facts of the human condition. This is what, if we look for what it means to be human, let alone the question of the essence and so on and so forth, the condition, it's not essence, it's not the human essence, it's not human nature, it is the human condition. But to dismiss that as non-important because we had to take a trendy kind of, maybe, to be honest, really, I mean, I don't have patience with that, an anti-theoretical, to be sure, to make it more trendy, theoretical anti-humanist position. No. I mean, because it is actually what we had to do is acknowledging this is our condition, not because of our choosing, right? And so we had to act on that, the power of acting, to go back to Spinoza. That's what we can do. So let's do it the right way. And we do it the right way precisely by understanding also the fundamental questions of ethics, even the way, for example, beautifully and importantly set by, say, in Aristotle, right? I mean, where, again, ethics, in addition to philosophy being the science of distinction, ethics becomes the science of freedom. Again, not that freedom, not at all I do as I please, but the freedom over contingency. Freedom is contingency, what can be and can also not be, what I can do and can also not do. So we had to focus really on this question of becoming contingency singularity, if we are serious about the possibility of changing the world, because right now we are going towards total distraction, right? And total immorality. I mean, if we look at these people who present themselves as the leaders of the countries and so on, those who govern us, they're completely immoral. I mean, we see right now what's happening in the U.S. with the judiciary, what's called the Congress, the committee questioning, right, Pam Bondi. I mean, what kind of situation is that when there is no sense of a decency, no idea of what it means to live life? What is important, what is dear to life, in addition to the people killed, and you mentioned that, Richard, in Minneapolis, from Rene Good to Alex Preddy and the others, and the child, Liam, the 5-year-old child. I mean, who now cannot sleep at night, doesn't want to talk, as his father is saying. I mean, these are the most important questions in life. This is what we had to address, and this is, we had to find a way to, yes, go back or find new ways of living life, creating a situation in which, care, love, and relations, and what is ultimately really, really important is actually brought to the fore in ways that become not permanent in the sense of fixity precisely, but where becoming can have its course of betterment of situations in which people can thrive in their real life. Like, as you were saying, Richard, if one thinks also about Gaza, and I mean, it's amazing. I mean, but it is true that this is happening. It has been happening for years now, and the situation continues this way. And one thinks what it means to really, for children, sleep at night with the flood and the rain and so on and so on. But this is, we see, I mean, if we hurt ourselves, I mean, we see what it means. I mean, we really had to think in these terms, I don't know of a real life, daily life. It is there that we had to change things. And we change things by changing first our way of thinking, right, about things and of living accordingly. This is what it means to say communism, a form of life. This, a completely different way of living life.
No, it's a beautiful way to end it, to think about the ontologization of communism, or the communization of ontology is a fundamental return to the question of the good life in terms of its form, not only in terms of its formation and its form, but in terms of how it might become adequate to the event of communism, the event of abolition, which would give this form its name. And I just want to say thank you so much, Bruno and Richard, for joining me today. You can get the book. It's out now with minor compositions. Is there anything else you're both working on? We already mentioned, of course, some new books coming out. In terms of anything you'd like to plug, anything you'd like people listening to go find out your work. Of course, if you buy this book, you will learn a lot about Bruno and Richard's books if you haven't already, and then you can go buy those, because it is a very good exposition in many ways of the projects of this ongoing collaboration, and of course your individual works. And Richard, you're not allowed to leave without promoting your new album of drumming as well. I'm sorry about this. So plug away, folks, plug away.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm also coming to the point where I'm sharing more about the music that I do. So you can look me up for that as well. And I do have a new solo drum set and percussion album out. But thank you for the opportunity. And I agree with Adam that if you go for this book, it will provide a portal into many other things that Bruno and I have been working on over many years. So I think it's the right one to pick up.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure.